Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. This is episode 3, I think is the way I'm going to notate this from here on out. My name's Tom Luongo, and we've got a lot to talk about. It's Tuesday, it's November 12th, it's 2019, and Nigel Farage, the man who is Mr. Brexit himself, may have finally saved Brexit from the vile clutches of the Davos Crowd. Now, you guys all know what I mean when I say the Davos Crowd, right? That is the unelected, shadowy financiers and power brokers and oligarchs that dominate the British, European, and U.S. deep states, as it were. They gather every year at Davos to decide on how best they think they're going to run the world. Well, I've got news for you. They don't actually, but they think they do, and they do a lot of damage as they go about their business. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to talk about looking ahead to December and why I think Angela Merkel's time as Germany's chancellor is likely over. There's a lot going on in Germany, and both myself and the guys over at the Duran, Alex and Alex, have covered this extensively. I just wanted to do it in a podcast format. So we're going to do that today as well. So before we get to all of that, I want to remind you that you can follow my work over at my blog, which is at www.tomluongo.me. You can also follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. Live streams, they happen every Monday and at 8 p.m. and Friday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on YouTube. Warning, I'm a bad boy. I got a potty mouth, and I'm not afraid to use it. You can also support me, not only me, actually, as a verified publisher, but also anyone else who is by downloading and installing the Brave browser, where you can get paid in crypto tokens called BAT for voluntarily being served internet advertising, as opposed to whatever Google thinks you should get and what Google should get paid for. Moreover, Brave severely limits the amount of spyware following you around the internet and helps protect your online privacy while saving you time and bandwidth by blocking all those data snoopers, etc., that are feeding the growing surveillance state. And lastly, as always, you can support me over at my Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can sign up for the private market reports published every Wednesday and Sunday, and or the Gold, Goats, and Guns monthly investment newsletter designed to wrap up all the geopolitical chaos, global macroeconomics, and shifting cultural and technological trends into a retail investor-focused portfolio strategy designed to help you make sense of a world going mad. All right. I got my trusty cup of coffee. I got a beverage. It's a little too early to do the adult beverage thing. Let's get started. All right, let's talk about Farage and him saving Brexit. So earlier this week, Nigel Farage, yesterday as a matter of fact, Nigel Farage, leader of the Brexit Party, came out and said he's going to stand down all of his candidates that are running in seats that were won by the Tories in 2017. Now, this is significant because it effectively creates a quote-unquote Leave alliance, which Nigel has been trying to put together for months, but he can't, and he couldn't. And the main reason he couldn't is because the Tories will never give him that. The Tories fundamentally are tribal, as he pointed out in another talk later on, and they feel entitled as the leading party to not make a deal with somebody who's a lesser party. In politics, you never attack down and you never deal down, right? You can't do that. Politics is all about fronting that you're the strong man. And so, of course, were there discussions behind the scenes between Farage and Boris Johnson, at least through proxies? Of course there were. Do Farage and Johnson like each other? No, they don't. Do the Tories like Farage? No, they don't. As a matter of fact, they hate him. But they also recognize his value if they want to actually remain in power and remain relevant, because Farage embarrassed the crap out of them at the European elections back in May. The Tories got less than 10% of the vote. Farage got nearly 30, and he did it with a party that was 5 weeks old. That's how frustrated and angry and how fluid party loyalty is in this situation, with all of the Brexit betrayal that's been going on all sides of the political fence. And Boris Johnson has helped to solidify the Tory Leave voters under his rubric, right? According to all the polls. But at the same time, he's not nearly trustworthy enough to a lot of Leave voters, and they're more than willing, ultimately, to jump ship, vote for Nigel on principle alone, Nigel's people on principle alone, because they know that Nigel's correct when he says that this deal that he signed with the EU is not Brexit. This withdrawal treaty is not Brexit. It's better than Theresa May's deal, but, lipsticks, pigs, all that kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, Johnson had to come to Farage in some way, but he couldn't do it officially. And so on Sunday night, as Nigel pointed out, Johnson made a speech publicly on television saying we're going to ditch political alignment, go for a Canada-style free trade agreement, but with no political alignment. And that was the key phrase for Farage, because it's the political alignment, it's the political institutions of the European Union that Nigel Farage has waged a 25-year war against. And practically single-handedly at first. And so, you gotta admire the man's spunk. You gotta admire the man's heart. You gotta admire his grit. And you also have to admire his political savvy to understand that he made his big ask to the British people. Back me over Boris Johnson. And the polls didn't shift his way. As a matter of fact, it created a lot of anger. And maybe that was, if you're really conspiratorial, you believe that Farage's controlled opposition. That, by doing that, he pushed a lot of people into Boris's camp. And now, see, he doesn't have any other option but to betray Brexit. And honestly, that's the kind of thinking that's one or two steps too far down the conspiratorial rat hole. Sometimes people make tactical or strategic errors, or sometimes they make tactical or strategic decisions that you disagree with, but that does not necessarily mean that makes them controlled opposition. Not everybody is hyper competent. Sometimes they're just people. More often than not, they're just people. And Occam's razor in political analysis, no matter how murky it gets, is usually the right analysis. And the truth of the matter is that nobody in the Davos crowd wants Brexit. They're all trying desperately to stop it. They've all put in place their minions to stop it however they can. And Boris Johnson is one of them. And now the question is, can they do so against the people themselves and their champion, as flawed as he is, Nigel Farage? Because Farage is flawed in a lot of other areas, but he's not flawed when it comes to nationalist, populist, and sovereignty issues. He's a patriot. He's a unionist. And even his staunchest detractors, who aren't, ideologically possessed jackasses, will give him credit for that. So Farage did the right thing the other day, or yesterday, putting the choice back to the British people to decide how many seats they're going to give the Brexit Party to hold Boris's feet to the fire on the pledges and the promises he's now made, which is free trade agreement with no political alignment, no extension of the withdrawal agreement beyond the end of 2020. These are the pledges that Boris has made internally to the ERG, the hard Brexiteer European research group, like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Owen Patterson and Steve Baker and the rest of them, Mark Francois. And they are all on board with Boris. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't been bought off or that they're not Tories first and everything else second. Never forget that. Okay? The British deep state is deep, it's old, it's biting, and it's powerful. Okay? But why this is important, because somebody asked me last night on my live stream, they said, Tom, okay, just to remind everybody, because you talk about Brexit all the time, it's like, why is this so important? I'm like, it's a very good question. It's one that I forget to cover at the outset of all this, political tactics and strategy and all of this stuff. And that's that Brexit is about changing the dynamic between the people and the government. Brexit is very much as I said on last week's podcast, very much a representation of the people's understanding that there's something fundamentally wrong with their government. The V for Vendetta thing. They understand that fundamentally these people are corrupt. They don't care. They are only in it for themselves, and they have their agenda, and they think we're all stupid, deplorable pieces of garbage that need to be pushed towards their best version of themselves against their will, kicking and screaming, and destroyed if necessary. And we see that all over the world. We see it in the uprisings in Chile. We see it in the uprisings in now the unbelievably now just petulant, violent, and vandalistic actions by the student protesters in Hong Kong, the blatant overthrowing by a military coup of Evo Morales in Bolivia. We're seeing it everywhere, right? The cynical move by Donald Trump to move tanks in to protect to keep the Syrian oil, to try and starve the Assad government, which is just disgusting. But it is what it is, and it's who these people are. And it's their generational imprint. It's who they are. It's what they are, and it's not going to stop. And Brexit breaks through that. Brexit is the victory by the people, which then gives hope to everybody else trying to stop this process, stop this ridiculous amount of gaslighting, social engineering, and the rest, which is all brought about by all this funny money and all this corrupt money that runs around. It just gives billions of dollars to the most corrupt, venal, and disgusting people on the planet to go and destroy the lives of decent people all around the world. That's the basic dynamic here. And Brexit is a part of that. Brexit is that moment of saying, no, that's enough. When I see the polls in Italy continuing to move in Matteo Salvini's direction, I saw a poll this morning. The Lega is back up to 35%. 5-Star has betrayed their people, and they're now down towards the 16% mark. And if they drop below it, they're going to drop that 5% within 2 months. Okay. Lega will move to 45%, and it will be crazy. And I see that, and I go, yes, the Italians get it. Yes, they understand. I see it when I talk to people who assist me in understanding Eastern European politics. For example, I have friends in both Germany and Hungary who give me good information all the time about what's happening there and their perspective on it. Some of them are pretty prominent political operatives and political actors in their respective countries and have been for years. And they really helped me to understand some of the nuances of how these countries operate. And, obviously if it's, you're talking about Germany, you're also talking about Austria and other countries like that. So the more I understand European politics, the more I understand the dynamics at play here, the more I realize how important Brexit is. Okay. And we take it one step further. A true Brexit has huge ramifications like I said, for the world at large. When you look at NGOs like the White Helmets, the Integrity Initiative, Five Eyes, right? These are all MI6 CIA operations. Five Eyes is obviously just a conglomeration of the five intelligence apparatuses of 5 major Western countries. But when you see these NGOs like the White Helmets, the co-founder of the White Helmets getting pushed out of a building in Ankara yesterday, got news for you, that guy didn't commit suicide. Or the Integrity Initiative being outed as a MI6, losing its charity status after it was outed as an MI6 propaganda operation. You realize that we're beginning to really pay dividends on my idea of we live in a post-Dorothy Oz, and Brexit is part of that. And we need to continue to fight for these things, no matter how many obstacles they put in front of us, because that's the only way we're going to win here. It's the only way we're going to improve things. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is Angela Merkel, and I think that the other angle on which that Brexit is important is because if a conservative coalition, conservative Brexit Party coalition comes out of the December 12th election around the same time Merkel's coalition partner, the Social Democrats, and otherwise known as the SPD, are going to be having their party conference in December. And at this point in time, with the SPD imploding, a former powerhouse of a party, which I predicted they would collapse completely at a national level once they dropped below a certain threshold, and they have dropped below that threshold, and now they're starting to pull in single digits in areas that they used to actually dominate in. And so disastrous has their association with Angela Merkel been that they could, in their party congress in a couple of weeks, in less than a month, could demand the ouster of Merkel as Chancellor of Germany in order to stay in the national coalition in the Bundestag. This is, I coined the phrase on Fault Lines one morning, zombie Bundestag. It's a zombie parliament. It's a zombie Bundestag. And as I said in another article, the Greens getting thrashed in Thuringia puts at risk, serious risk, Merkel's ability to control the Bundesrat, which is the other house of the German legislature, the upper house of the German legislature. She's been able to control that by using the Greens as her veto by proxy, for all intents and purposes. And the Greens could lose the equivalent of 9 seats, thanks to Thuringia and a challenge to last year's Hessian election results, where AfD was denied a seat in the Hessian parliament, and the Greens and the Merkel CDU rule with a 1-seat majority. So if the AfD gets that seat, then the coalition has to be dissolved and the government has to fall. And that changes everything. So then changes the composition of the Bundesrat tremendously. And I've talked about this in recent articles over on my blog and over at strategicculture.org. So all this stuff is very, very important. And when you start to look at the trends that are in place in Germany, we have a dead economy walking. The Germans are in a recession. They're in a manufacturing recession. If Brexit goes through with a conservative Brexit Party coalition, that winds up with still the threat of a no-deal Brexit, the WTO Brexit on the table by the end of 2020, and you project that the German economy is going to continue to stagnate at best, if not collapse, as we move towards bank failures, and they push towards a banking union in order to stop a bank, continent-wide bank failure and everything else. Are you kidding? AfD is going to move from 14% to 25% within a month. The same things that happened, the same kind of situation that happened with Lega in Italy will happen with AfD in Germany. And when that happens, all bets are off. Katie bar the door. You will have your catalytic moment of European political and economic collapse, and the markets are going to go ballistic. And we've been handicapping that for a couple of years now in the Gold, Goats, and Guns investment newsletter and in market reports and everything else. And I've been talking about this for a long time. So I've got probably one of the best handles on it around. Couple that with, Emmanuel Macron, who now thinks that he's going to move into the power vacuum left by Angela Merkel, when he's vulnerable at home. Polls recently had him only beating Marine Le Pen in France 55-45. He trounced her 65-35 2 years ago. Again, another shock to the system and a failure on his part to get control of, say, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, or anything else. And it's only a 5-point swing at this point in the second round of the elections for her to become prime minister, or her to become president. Sorry. At the very least, Macron may even be the last president of the Fifth Republic of France. I've been talking to a good French friend of mine recently about these things, and he's, the younger generation is absolutely ready for a new form of government. So it's sincere. And then we look at Spain's elections the other day. Vox, the populist center-right or right-wing populist party, Vox, unfortunately backed by Steve Bannon, which gives me real the heebie-jeebies about being willing to, underwrite Vox's political bona fides or anything. I don't trust Steve Bannon as far as I could throw him, or I know I could probably punch him farther than I can throw him, but I don't trust that guy at all. I think he's a fake populist, and I think he's a scumbag and an authoritarian and a globalist. I'm agreed with Lee Stranahan on this completely. That Vox doubled their representation and caused another hung parliament in Spain. And people are angry with how they've treated Catalonia and their secession and their leadership and everything else. It's not going to get better. Spain is only going to get worse, and it's only going to become more and more ungovernable, just like Germany, just like France, just like the British, just like the UK. And it's only Farage standing up for country first and falling on his sword of his own personal ambitions that gives anybody any hope. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these things play out over the next few weeks. I just wanted to do a quick rundown of them all in one spot and to kind of tie all these things together. And then if you look at how that's affecting the capital markets, it's pretty obvious. The pound is finished falling against the euro and the dollar. The euro can't rally. European bond yields versus American bond yields, that spread is continuing to fall, meaning that we're seeing a preferential flow into U.S. debt versus U.S. assets, certainly with stock markets at all-time highs, versus European assets, which are still struggling. That's what you need to know. You need to understand that, these things don't happen overnight. they are trends that play out over the course of months or even if not a year. And all of these things are happening at the same time. And right now we've got, for example, gold is in a bit of a liquidity crunch because, there's an absolute demand for dollars at this point as people start to hoard them as they can see the political unrest in Europe unfolding and go, yeah, dude, I don't want to be in euros. I'll be in dollars. Thank you very much. And then, gold ownership is, being equated with money laundering. When we look at like the Danske Bank, investigation of the Danske Bank, it's the whole undercurrent there is if you truck in gold bars, you're a money launderer like a Russian oligarch. I mean, that's what they're telling you. And a lot of that is, again, British deep state stuff. That's why Brexit's important. It depowers those people. And they need to be depowered badly. So we can move forward from the 19th century. Because that's what we're stuck in. We're stuck in this kind of 19th century geopolitical model of how the world is supposed to work. And even though the British Empire is over, it's the infrastructure that it created is still somewhat active. And is still capable of real damage. And that's the kind of the takeaway point. And that's why Brexit is so important. Because it really helps to depower that. All right. Well, that's what I've got for today, guys. I think that's probably more than enough. So if you liked what you heard today, please, like, subscribe to the podcast, share it with people, share it with your friends on Twitter and whatnot. This will also go out simultaneously on YouTube. So if you enjoyed it, I hope you did. I know I did. I know I enjoyed doing it. So like everything else, we'll talk soon. Keep your stick on, guys.